So, good morning. As stated, I am an art historian, and this morning, as part of our Demystifying Contemporary Art series that Marion and I are having so much fun with, because we have these conversations about how we understand art and history and what is contemporary art and how do you define it. So today I wanted to focus on, and in the way we're working these lecture series is you don't have to have the knowledge from the last one to enjoy this one. You can drop in for the third one and see us, and they all kind of exist independently, but they are part of a bigger puzzle, which is trying to figure out what art means, especially sometimes the art that's made of our own time. So I'm going to model the way that I make meaning with art as an art historian, and it is about the text. So the foundations of the way that we understand or talk about art, whether it's in the New York Times or on the internet or on social media with critics, is based in a history that's only 250 years old. The profession of art history is only 250, but there were two really important men in the 50s that rose to be dialectically opposed to one another, and that is Clement Greenberg and Rosenberg, uh, Harry Rosenberg, right? Clem, Rosenberg and Greenberg, and we can go forward. So they have two very different ways of thinking about art, as we can see reflected in our own time, which is we have two really different ways of thinking about the world. It seems we're bifurcated or polarized, as they say. But sometimes when we put opposites against one another, the connection and the sparks that fly tell us about our own culture. So looking back, Clement Greenberg was very much a part of what they called modernist theory. There wouldn't be the painters of the 50s, 60s, and early 70s if it wasn't for the writing and the thinking that he did and the great influence that he had on the culture of his time. So the things that he says in a lot of really fancy language through many, many essays, he's telling you deeply here about the purpose. He wants to call attention to art, the limitations that constitute the medium of painting, which he wrote a lot about. He felt like painting was separate from sculpture, was separate from theater. He wanted things to exist in their own category and play by the rules. The flat surface, the shape of the support, the properties of pigment were treated by the old masters as negative factors. They didn't want you to think about those things, the old masters. They had to, he says, i.e. things that had to be overcome to create a seamless illusion. Modernist painting has come to regard these same limitations as positive factors that are to be acknowledged openly, and in his mind, probably first and foremost. So in this case, I have the paintings that he was looking at and very much influencing these people in their studios, which is Barnett Newman from right at the turn of the century. And on the other hand, Rosenberg says things like he considers the formal aspects, the quality of the paint on the surface. He considers those things to be absolutely meaningless. And he wants to focus on emotion rather than form. So he's going to go into the content and the emotional state of the artist. And here he is. This is the war of the words, right? He's talking about Clement Greenberg, his friend here, and he's saying, the critic who goes on judging in terms of school styles form, as if the painter were still concerned with producing a certain kind of object, the work of art, instead of living on the canvas, is bound to seem a stranger. So these two, it was like a word wrestling match between the two of them. And in the middle of this wrestling match are artists like Mark Rothko, who started out making forms, things that looked like perhaps narration or stories, and ends up with just floating fields of color. I don't think there's anybody living or dead who ever did this better than he did. And it was about paint, and it was about surface, but at the same time, it was about a lot more spiritually. If you read what Mark Rothko says about his own work later here, he ends up making works as he's so disappointed with a commercial project at the Seagram's building in New York City that it wasn't going to suit his purposes or his ideas that he was going to embed in these canvases. he is commissioned to do an entire chapel, which is in Texas, and it'll besides for being cleaned, it's still open today, the Rothko Chapel, and he does go very dark later. And so this is a later from 1968, as he is leaving the confines of the writers like Rosenberg and Greenberg, and we're moving more into the 60s. So this is a painter, and we're going to look at painters that live through modernism into contemporary art, and we're going to see this borderline where their work changes from older ideas to newer ideas, where they're also starting to be influenced by artists that they see working in new paradigms. So Mark Rothko, before his suicide in 1970, his work does get darker, and his interest in color changes, and the image continues almost to disappear from his work entirely. Another one that's influenced through this era by the writers and really steadfastly stays within a certain way of working for her entire career, which spans almost the entire century, is Helen Frankenthaler. Uses her body in ways that artists really hadn't, uses the canvas to spill and drip. She does see Jackson Pollock, and she sees what he's doing. She believes her work to be much more intentional. The thing that frustrated Clement Greenberg was that he could not remove the artist from their personalities. Jackson Pollock, he says, he became much too gothic with his personality for me. And Rothko would always talk about what he wanted art to do, which wasn't just about the surface, it was about the soul. And Helen Frankenthaler would say similar things about her own work. And she and Clement Greenberg also dated for 5 years, so she still resisted his charms. And we see her working all the way into the 70s with her masterworks, these larger canvases where her lyrical use of color becomes completely apparent and mesmerizing. And I want us to remember, as we arc towards contemporary art, the artists get mixed a little bit more up in culture. We think about the legacy of the Warhol era, the popular culture wanting to sort of hang on to this creativity, this mystery, that when artists just make art for themselves. And I love this ad. This came out when I call myself a baby art historian in 1990, and it made me think a way about Rolex watches, like in a way that I never had. And she took a lot of heat for being in her studio with her cute little espadrilles and her Rolex watch on. But she's been a little bit of an enigma in that she loves the fact that people say her compositions are prettier, and she doesn't back down from that. And we can imagine the kind of engendered stereotypical pushback that she encountered in her career. So seeing her embrace it this way was a big deal, because formalism was all the rage in the 90s, and we were certainly moving on to something else. But this painting is from 1989, and this sold at Sotheby's, and I took a careful look at it, because it's rare that you get to see front and back of artists' objects. Usually when they're up for sale, they'll show you, especially if they are titled on their reverse. So this one is signed and dated and titled, and it's about sleepwalking, which tells you a little bit about her working method. But these are things, and you would love a Frankenthaler as much for these passages of paint that you might see through the back of the canvas that tells you how much she let that paint seep in. So we're thinking, and Helen and everybody in the art world is thinking about art as objects. And then alongside that, you have thinkers, you have critics who, including me as a baby art historian, we're learning to put things in frameworks, which means, do you want to use psychoanalysis? Do you want to use feminism? Do you want to use performance theory? And I was always this kind of person that says, I want to use all of them. And one of the people I stumbled upon that helps me think about art still to this day is a writer named Peggy Phelan. And she wrote a book called Unmarked, which took the emoji, it took my brain and exploded it. And it's never really been the same since. And I was telling Marianne as we prepared, I walked around with this book cover, which you see to your right, for many years. It was part of my library, and I referenced it and I wrote about it. And I did not realize that it was the artist Alice Neal that was chosen for the cover, because she is such a person who's known for seeing, that Peggy Phelan wanted to experiment with the idea of, what if she closed her eyes? Could she still see? What is in the visionary plane of Alice Neal that is unmarked as of yet? So this is the very beginning of this book, and she states the thesis. And she's saying that we do spend a lot of time and intention and give power to things that aren't really there. The spirit or the memory of someone who is lost, things that do not appear, things that have been taken down, things that have been removed. And this is the 80s. And she's putting together some theory of some of the art that she's beginning to see, and also performance. And she does go out into the world of the real, and she even considers the idea of an unborn fetus as having a lot of power, even though we are not able to see it other than in a sonogram, which still to this day isn't really an accurate depiction of what's happening inside the womb. So we talked about Alice Neal as being someone who defies categorization. She works from 1900 until the late 80s, and she works that whole time. And here you see her in the 60s, and I love thinking about this unfinished work. This young man came to see her in her studio in 1965. She often brought people in that she didn't know into her studio to paint. She brought him off the street. His name was James Hunter. He told her he was being drafted. She never saw him again and never finished this portrait. So what is unseen and unmarked about this, and the unknowability about James Hunter's future, his destiny? He was not listed among the dead in Vietnam, but we just don't know what happened to him. And Alice Neal goes from being able to see to giving up that idea of seeing everything. And sometimes things have to remain unmarked. But then to words, I use words. I started thinking about the late 70s and early 80s, and the ideas of word art in both Jenny Holzer with her truisms. This is a work of art from the MoMA collection, where she just alphabetized all these pithy sayings that she had and printed them. And it was a gift from her to the museum, and it is a part of their permanent collection as a work on paper. It's one of her more long-lasting artworks, because many of the things that she did were permanent or impermanent and in public spaces. Like her work in the month of March in 1982 in Times Square. And I love the documentation pictures, because once something is finished in performance, it is over. And the art world is starting to think about this: performances, happenings, earth art, art that disappears. It's almost a precursor to the art, or even like you're viewing us, that things that flicker and disappear. But these are signs, and they use her famous words and flicker on and off and repeat, as we know advertising does. And I just love the time-lapse photography where you see all the brake lights in New York City. And imagine seeing this in Times Square now. Expiring for love is beautiful but stupid. The minute I saw this, I thought, the art world, I love you forever, and maybe it is beautiful but stupid. I'm not going to expire for the art world, but it's funny, but it's serious, and it can make you laugh, and it can make you feel bittersweet all at the same time, and it's where she's putting it. Now, this isn't an object. Jenny Holzer's thought a lot about objects, but this is something different that mixes in performance. And when it blinks and turns off, it's that billboard is then unmarked. Abuse of power comes as no surprise. And this is a great community project. The person that was programming this Spectracolor there with the phone number on it thought, well, when this goes unused, why couldn't artists use it? So it became a great public art project in the early 80s. Before, you can see even before much of our public space was taken over by advertising and corporations. So many of the work of our word artists or our conceptual artists that love the breakdown of the image, and then they see Warhol and they see some of the pop art, and they begin to pull their images from advertising very powerfully to talk about the seduction of the image. And Barbara Kruger starts out in the advertising world, much as some of her predecessors did as billboard painters, but she was a layout artist. So very good at collage, very good at pulling source images and thinking about what sells to people. So a lot of her work is and continues to be, this is a living artist, as is Jenny Holzer, about the seduction of words and images. And both she and Jenny Holzer go in and out of political and socially dynamic causes, and they are known to put the power of their perceptive use of word and images to good use for different causes. And most recently, Barbara Kruger did a Time magazine cover, and her work, the way that she matches these fonts, has become iconic and very recognizable. She had on the sides of shopping bags, "I shop, therefore I am." And I think a lot of people would recognize that, but not even know that that was really a fine art piece, which is her desire for going back into the thinking about the image differently.
Is there more on it?
No, that was my last slide.
Okay.
So see how that happens? It's like the machine decided that my presentation would be unmarked and we would not be allowed to see it anymore, because then we will appreciate that we could see it at one point. So we're going to take a really short break, and we will answer questions at the end. And if you're interested at all in the source material of either Greenberg, Rosenberg, Peggy Phelan, please, we can put up maybe a bibliography that is the source material for a lot of this thinking. And I think it's super important. You don't always have to dive that deep, but it is like having a relationship. And the more you know about the artists and their motivations and the culture that they lived in, the more you understand the things that they make. So I'm going to mute very quickly, and we're just going to do a little, what do you call that?
We're just going to
flip seats.
Flip seats. And I'll be right with you. Good morning, you guys. Thanks so much for coming. I'm so glad to have you here at the Spaces Foundation electronically, and I hope to see you all in person when our season starts. Our first show is October 6th here in person, and we will continue the lecture series throughout the 23-24 season. This is a special lecture series to raise funds for the MADE, the Major Art District Expansion Project. So we really appreciate your support on this as we remodel our new space. And I'm going to pick up where Catherine left off. And just confirming that everything is working here on my computer. So we've been giving a lot of background in the first lecture, and in this lecture also we're kind of setting you up for what happens. And Catherine and I decided that the 1980s was where we believe that contemporary art really began, although that's a hotly debated topic in the art historical world. Some say 1945, some say 1960, 1970, 2000. But when I was thinking about putting this lecture together, I was researching what happened in the 80s and why we think that. So first, I just wanted to define contemporary art. So we're saying 1980 to the present, or the late 20th century to the early 20th century. So the art movement that emerged after World War II, and before we were talking about postmodernism, the postmodernism period, which we're kind of defining as 1945 to 1950 up into the contemporary art world that we're saying in the 1980s began, blurred the line between what was fine art and what was not fine art. And in the 80s, we started to really understand what defines contemporary art. So there was a lot of glitz, a lot of excess that helped to define contemporary art. And we went over a lot of the movements that were previous, like conceptual art, minimalism. All these were breaking out in the 60s and the 70s. We had land art, video art, text art. And then this is an image of Damien Hirst. He created these animals, if you will, soaked in formaldehyde in these vitrines. This piece is called The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. And in the beginning, Damien Hirst was really heralded as making breakthroughs in contemporary art, and it was very exciting what was happening then. But then later, so now he's still making work, and it kind of, that part where the glitz and the excess of the 80s and the commercialism, and he turned really into being a market darling where people were buying up his works like crazy. It became more of a commodity. And today, actually, a lot of artists have kind of disagree with the artworks that he's mass producing just for the sake of making money. But in the beginning, it was really exciting. And other artists that were at that time, Damien Hirst, Jenny Saville, Banksy, Tracy Emin, Jeff Koons, Lucian Freud, all of these guys were coming up at that time with new kinds of artworks that were really representative of the period that they were living in. One of the artists, Basquiat, that I have here on the right, became really well known in the 80s. He did not go to art school, and he had this really energetic, expressionistic, painterly style. I'm still wanting my notes, is what I keep thinking about. So I'll just try one more time. Can you go get Edwin?
Sure.
So during this time, Basquiat became really famous really quick. He was represented by Mary Boone, and Mary Boone was one of the first gallerists who started to realize that art could sell as a commodity during the 80s. And so the culture in the 80s really influenced what was happening. This idea of someone becoming famous, almost like a movie star because of their artwork. Okay, so I was telling you about the 1980s culture. So we had this new global economic system. Cocaine became really prevalent. If you recall, we had a lot of problems. Just say no to drugs, etc. And so the 80s are critical of understanding that contemporary moment. And art became a luxury exchange, and the difference between the high and the low brow became obscured. So Basquiat, whose image is on the right, was actually a street artist in the beginning and a graffiti artist, and he was also a drug addict, and he had never gone to school. So what we used to refer to this type of artist or this type of art making as lowbrow, he immediately became like a celebrity and became highbrow. I still can't do it. There we go. And then I just wanted to point out that in the past there was these large, grand historical narratives, and we talked about that last week. And so one of the critics of the time, Frederick Jameson, summarized the spirit of that age by saying goodbye to the grand old historical narratives and hello to consumerist desire, increased consumption, and mass media. And that's really what's going on here with the Basquiats. And then below, I added a picture of a painting by Eric Fischl. I've talked to you before last time we met about that I am a painter. I'm not an art historian, and I love the figurative art that came out of the 80s, so I'll talk a little bit more about the figurative art that came out of the 80s. But Eric Fischl is one of those painters, and he was really focused on the suburban or the middle class American plight, if you will, or their way of living, and was documenting that. And this really, again, not as gestural and exciting as maybe a Basquiat, but still really exciting gestural mark making, not that clean, refined, figurative artwork we've had in the past. So here's some more pictures of Eric Fischl. He was born in 1948. He was a draftsman and taught at the New York Academy of Figurative Art. He is known as a neo-expressionist painter, which I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And he did these pictures of American suburbia, but the imagery, as you can see in the top left corner, this is called Bad Boy from 1981, were a little risque. There's something going on there. They're a little disturbing. He does a lot of nudes that are just kind of people reclining in their everyday homes or in the pool, and really documented this life that on the outside looks pretty good, but then on the inside you're always wondering, like, what's really going on there? It feels a little disturbing. So this was a new way of painting the disturbing aspects of everyday life, if you will, in the 80s. And they're really psychologically fraught. And by 1986, he became famous, just like Basquiat did, also taken on by Mary Boone. And he had a retrospective at the Whitney, and so just really took off. What the critics at the time were saying is that he exposed a nerve. He exposed something that was disturbing, that was going on in our times, and I would say that he was really focusing on bringing to light this idea of the wish for the ideal life or the perfect life that suburbia was supposed to bring, and capitalism and commercialism was supposed to bring. And he was, again, another art market darling where people were scooping him up, purchasing the work, and covered by the New York Times, and was just really well loved. And he's continuing to work today. My next slide continues to discuss the art market, and thinking about the 1980s as those golden years for contemporary art. There was a lot of new money coming into Wall Street. The Japanese yen took off. There was aggressive marketing by the auction houses. And for the first time ever, really, the art market expanded, and people were buying art for a lot of money. There was a lot of things going on during that time, as I said, with the expansion of Wall Street and just the glitz and the glamour of the 1980s. There were art fairs that started to pop up everywhere, Art Basel, in New York, in Paris, in Cologne, and in Chicago. The biennials started to happen all across the world. So you can see there's this explosion of looking at art, collecting art, seeing art that had never happened before. So that's one of the reasons why I was really reflecting on the 80s becoming a big shift and when contemporary art began. Julian Schnabel, who made paintings by breaking crockery and gluing the shards of these ceramic plates to paintings, took off by being represented by Mary Boone as well. And I included here a Sotheby's graph. There was a lot of graphs on how the art market took off at that time. But you can see in this graph that was created by two business professors from NYU, last names May and Moses, and it's now called the Sotheby's May Moses Indices. They really controlled and studied what sells and how it sells for Sotheby's, and you can see how that graph just kept going up, 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 up. So how important the commercial aspects of the art market affected what we thought was good for example. When before then, artists really just made art because they wanted to express something of their times, of course, but because they had a passion to do so, not with the idea of becoming famous, like Julian Schnabel here on the cover of Art News in 1985. Here's some Julian Schnabel paintings. It's odd because I thought when I was preparing this lecture, I would get mostly artwork that I was very passionate about. But when I was just trying to be across the board fair and be descriptive of what was going on in the world, I had to include Julian Schnabel as one of those artists that took off during the time, and not someone that was one of actually my favorite artists. And again, he was really hot for a while and then died down, similar to the Damien Hirst story. But in the 1980s, his paintings were also being sold by Mary Boone. And this little quote that I have here is by Eileen Kinsella, and this quote is in 2020. And the reason why I included it is so that we can see that the press and the media are really influencing us as to what we like and what we buy and what museums will purchase and what they will show. So although he was really well known in the 1980s and his popularity died down in 2021, he was still being promoted and is still being promoted as a hot artist in order to increase his sales. And they referred to him at this time as being part of the zeitgeist. And that word will come up in the future as I continue to talk. The zeitgeist is really defining a specific mood or feeling of that time in history, or the ideas or the beliefs going on at that time. And also what was happening with Julian Schnabel and other artists is that what was going on at that time was a self-reflection. They were painting their own belief systems about themselves. We know the self-help movement really took off in the 80s. There were two primary art exhibitions that took place in the 80s. One was called The New Spirit of Painting, that was put together by a curator called Giacomides, and he also was influential in the other exhibition called Zeitgeist in the 80s in West Berlin. And he believed that this was one of the most important exhibitions of the time. Now, when we look back at this exhibition, we realize today that it was mostly all white men. There was no people of color, and all of these guys really had a positive sense of self, a really strong confidence, let's say. And they believed their artwork was reflecting what was going on at the time. But what it did was reflect how important self-expression was. These guys were painting huge canvases, really aggressive mark making. George Boslitz, Julian Schnabel, Francesco Clemente, Kiefer, Gerhard Richter, David Saleh, all of these artists were showing in this exhibition. And this is a great picture here of Boslitz. It looks like he still has a little hair left there, which we'll later see that is gone. But they really reflected this idea of individual creativity and threw away all of this kind of ideas that were from the 60s and the 70s and even previously, where art had to be academic and more conceptual, like there has to be a deep thought behind it. These guys were very expressive. And what's interesting with these two exhibitions, as we analyze what's going on in the 80s with, as I mentioned, the economic growth was incredible. In the 90s, all of this crashes, but in the 80s, people had a lot of money and they were spending a lot of money. But there was also a lot of technological advances, the first PC, the first Mac computer, the internet. And then late in the 80s, we have things going on in Europe that was breaking down any type of societal control by the government, such as the fall of the Berlin Wall. So this crack in what was going on in the world was really influential on the artists of the time. So the curator said about his own show that it changed the art world. Of course, a curator is going to say that, but a lot has been written about it, and I do think it changed the art world, declaring again what is good and what is worthy, for better or worse. So this was the conceptual art that we were looking at in the 60s and 70s, and you can see how much different the previous artwork was with this really expressionistic, thick mark making, mixed media, anything goes style, jumping out of this kind of conceptualism where we had people just focused on form and ideas and much more clear, structured artwork. So this is George Boslitz that I showed you the previous picture, and he had the beard, and now he has no hair. And he's one of the neo-expressionists that came out of this exhibition, and he painted these really big canvases, wide mark making, and figurative. So this neo-expressionist style was a breakaway from the intellectual and formalism of the conceptual art, and he's known for being kind of brash and aggressive. He painted his paintings and then flipped the figures upside down, he said, to remove any type of conceptual preconceived ideas that you might have about the figure. So he wanted to take away any type of communication that you might get from seeing a figure sitting in space. So by turning it upside down, it was his way of removing any type of idea behind it. So this work on the right is called Nude in the Bottle. It's oil tempera on wood, and it's about 90, each one is about 98 inches wide. And here's another Boslitz. And again, he was known as controversial. His work was grotesque. It was shocking. And a lot of the artwork from this period, this neo-expressionist period, had this same kind of idea behind it. You can see the figures upside down. You can see the really wide mark-making systems, the bright pink, the lime green, the garish yellow. This painting is called The Lovers from 1984. Personally, I love this style. I love the big mark making. I love the German expressionists, the original German expressionists, and these neo-expressionists for that, that they're using their whole arm. They're really in the moment, in the act of painting, using their body. It's a much more intuitive and responsive way to work on the canvas rather than thinking and planning everything out ahead of time. So painting continued in this way for a while into validating the figurative work again, but not in the academic way that we had thought of before, but in this expressionistic way. The other show that happened in the 80s at the same time was called Zeitgeist, and that was in West Berlin. And Germany was seeing a big rebellious period at that time. And many of us are aware that the Berlin Wall came down in '89. So it was leading up to this Berlin Wall coming down. And after this show came up, things were escalating quickly. Like the people of the time were fighting authority more and more and more. So in this exhibition, again, it was the same curator who put it together, and he felt that this was a perspective of a wider liberation that was coming on, and it was kind of commenting on the time about this spiritual, cultural, political upheaval that he foresaw to come in the future. This large projection on the top is an artwork made by Jonathan Borofsky. It's called Man with a briefcase, and he was commenting on the social norm or a dislike of the social norm. And then on the left, you can see a piece that this is actually, it looks like it's an installation view, but it's actually part of Joseph Beuys's installation with lots of clay pieces around and lots of tools around, giving the impression of an art studio in action, so that there was no finished artwork there. It was just like you could wait and see someone enter the space at any moment and start picking up these tools and making clay or making sculpture out of the clay. So these artists at the time were considered these big, heroic, symbolic artists that kind of changed the way art was thought about. Here's an image of Joseph Beuys creating the installation. Beuys was a teacher, a performance artist, an art theorist. He reflected on concepts of humanism, and he was one of the founders of the Fluxus movement, which was a type of performance art. And I'll talk a little bit more about performance art in a few slides from now, but he was really one of the people that believed art should be for everyone. So what was happening at this time is that it wasn't just the few highly academic, wealthy families that were creating the artists of our time. It was becoming that anyone could make art. You didn't need any special talent, so to speak. And he taught that in his art classes. He eventually got fired from the college he was speaking at, or he was teaching at, because he was allowing anyone to enter into his classroom, whether they were matriculated or signed up to go to school there or not. And of course, the school was a little upset at that. They were not paying their tuition. They were just coming in to hear Joseph Beuys speak. And he eventually lost his job for that. So this leads us into talking about schools. So at this time also, the MFA, the Masters of Fine Art degrees, proliferated. So degrees were becoming really important for artists. Artists were going to school more than they ever had. Anybody could go to any college because it was more affordable and than it had been. And in this image, we have a picture of students from Cal Arts on the right. They're doing a performance piece. And then on the bottom, we have Joseph Beuys giving a lecture. He often wrote with chalk on the floor, on the chalkboard, and many of those chalkboard pieces were preserved and are very famous now in museums. But Yale, Cal Arts, all of these types of art degrees became a way for the artist to get discovered. Everyone wanted to be the next Julian Schnabel or Eric Fischl or Boslitz. And James Elkins, who is an amazing writer on the arts, and was a professor at the Art Institute of Chicago, wrote that by the 1960s, the MFA was ubiquitous. Now the MFA is commonplace. And when I was actually going to school for my MFA, you know, I knew this, and we discussed it a lot in our classes, and we would have many gallerists come to Indiana University, where I was going to school, to try to even get students to not finish their degree, but just come right away to be represented by a gallery. And a lot of programs, including the Yale University, is really connected, if you will, and has close friends within the gallery business. So Yale is actually creating artists who are going to almost definitely be represented by a gallerist in New York City. So this is really new for the time, in the 1980s and the 90s, that this MFA is almost, unfortunately, students thought it was a guarantee into the art world. But now there are so many artists with so many master's degrees, many more than who are actually getting discovered, if you will, or actually showing in a gallery. So I think this proliferation of the Masters of Fine Arts degree also kind of discussed what was going on at the time and what was going on in the world of art. So after this became a thing and artists were noticing, like, why is everyone getting an MFA? A lot of artists started to rebel against this and didn't believe that the MFA was the in, that you needed an MFA to get into the gallery world. And neither should we as artists want to get in the gallery world. Artists start questioning, why are our artworks selling for, well, at that time, it may have been in the $1 million or $5 million range, but now up into the 2020 years, artworks are selling, into the $100 million or more range, and artists are really reflecting, starting back in the early 2000s, late 90s, like, this is not the purpose of art. This makes art only available for a small few, those collectors who can afford it, and the museums can't even buy it. So artists are starting to say, wait, my work will never even be seen by the public if one collector buys it, if a museum can't buy it. So this image is of Tanya Bruguera. She is a social practice artist, and she created her own art school as a form of social practice art that was free. And she documented everything and considered this to be a specific artwork, and became really well known in the world for working for the everyday artist. She's a Cuban performance artist and created these unconventional alternative schools. She called this school the Behavior Art Department. And it recognized her idea of performance art encompassing behavior, whereas she would work with the students one-on-one and discuss with them what was the importance of art, what was the importance of art making, and believed that there was a responsibility within the artist to be a good citizen, if you will. So the artist, in Tanya Bruguera's opinion, was an important citizen in order to affect social change. And I love that. And it's one of the reasons why I created this Spaces Foundation, to try to affect social change for the good of all concerned, not just for the few who might be able to afford one of these very expensive works of art. So we went from talking about Joseph Beuys with the Fluxus movement and performance artwork, and how Joseph Beuys believed art was for everyone, and then moving into the MFA, where artists thought that was going to be their ticket into a career, and then moving into the rebelliousness. So as we have talked about art in the first lecture, and even this lecture, we do see this kind of repetitive cycle of what artists believe are working for them, what artists then evolve into and rebel against, and then it comes full circle again and again. So after Tanya Bruguera starts to really invent social practice art, some artists take it even further. This is an artist called Rick Lowe, and he went out into the community in Texas and found a bunch of row houses that were dilapidated that nobody could live in, and he raised money and refurbished them and made them available as homes. So he transformed a group of neglected shotgun houses in Houston into this cultural hub. And throughout this time, people are realizing that art doesn't have to be just for the individual, but can be something that benefits the community. So he continues to work today and develop this idea of community-based art projects. And it's interesting, here at Spaces, we just had a meeting this morning. We're doing a collaborative art project with 2 other community organizations based on trauma and mental illness. And it's really for the same purpose, to help the community to bring to light something that we believe needs to be looked at, for example, to put it in simplistic terms. The mental illness trauma collaboration at Spaces is to discuss that a common ground to reverse discrimination against the mentally ill, and to bring to light that we all have some kind of trauma in our background. And the same with Rick Lowe here and his project Row Houses, that he was bringing to light the housing crisis for the African American community at that time. From this, we move into Ai Weiwei. Ai Weiwei is another social practice artist, if you would call him that. He also makes objects, he makes photographs, and he hires Chinese, he works in China, and he hires huge groups of people to work in his workshop. If you look at the piece in the bottom right-hand corner called Sunflower Seeds from 2010, each one of these seeds was made by an individual person in his workshop out of porcelain to look realistic. So what he's trying to discuss here is the conformity and the censorship that's inherent in modern China. But one of his first pieces, if you look to the left, is a picture of himself dropping a Han Dynasty urn from 1995. So he broke a really valuable urn and smashed it into pieces and documented that with photography, again to exhibit and show how he was fighting against, if you will, the social norm or of the political control the Chinese government had over his people. And he's been openly criticized, and he's been jailed, and he continues to make artwork that he believes will affect social change. And we're coming to our end now, so I'll move a little quicker. This is another artist who was working in the same venue, discussing how to help people through his artwork. And he set up, his name is Rikrit Teravanija, and he set up these, they look kind of like a soup kitchen, but what he was really trying to do was to create a participatory installation. So he would go in a gallery and set up the food. It was usually Indian food, and he would have a bunch of people cooking, and everyone would come and eat the food in the gallery, and he would have this documentation of a kind of a family meal, if you will, and then everyone would leave, and they would leave their dirty dishes and everything sitting out, and that was the exhibition that people would come to see in the future. So it revolved around sharing communal traditions and bringing people together, and all of these social practice artworks that evolved over time came from the original Fluxus movement or the performance pieces from the 70s and the 80s. And he was trying to help people to engage in the present moment, realizing what was important in life is talking, eating, relationships, communication. And my last slide is just a revision going back to what is contemporary art. And despite its name, contemporary does mean now, but it's not just about art made now. It's a much bigger world than that. It's more about the certain type or types of art that are made now, and the attitudes and the political environments that those artworks are being made in. I chose this last piece by Elizabeth Payton because in the 2000s, we see a lot of artists who are making artwork based on their friends, and it kind of stems out of Rikrit Teravanija's soup kitchens, if you will, where Elizabeth Payton believed that it was important to just look at her surroundings and paint her surroundings. And her surroundings were a lot of really well-known famous people. This is a portrait of David Bowie on the right and Kurt Cobain on the left. And the curator, Nicholas Boryod, stated that artistic expression had become no longer a collection of objects, but a state of encounter. The work of every artist is a bundle of relations with the world, giving rise to other relations, and so on and so forth. So that a handful of people from the 1990s started to work again back in traditional media to make representational work that reflected the world around them. So I think as we close this, just thinking about that contemporary art is often a reflection of turbulent crisis, conflicts, and arguments that are happening in the world around us, and that it's often unsolved. And as we try to talk about this, that we're hoping to demystify contemporary art, that it will never really be a cut and dry, really clear, this is contemporary art, because it's forever changing. But it does reflect the pressing issues of our day, which, identity, environmental issues. Now we're getting into what is virtual art, how does technology play a big role, and AI in the making of art. So that is the end of my 30 minutes. And I'd love to open it up if anybody has any discussion or any comments on anything that we've shared today.
We need to give you a little while to think about all that.
Yeah, that's a lot. And I know I talk really fast, so I'm happy to send you the recording of this if you would like to review it again. And we're really thankful that you came and supported us. And we'll be doing one more section, and then the last section will focus primarily on the 2000s up until 2023. We've given you a lot of background, and now, the last section just went from the 90s kind of into the 2000s. Is there anything you want to add about what we've talked about, or?
I say that what Marianne said near the end is that this is ad infinitum. It doesn't stop. It won't stand still for us to get like a really good look at it. And that is both the frustration and the joy of it. And when you surrender to not knowing everything, I think is when the real enjoyment of the moment can pop up. Like you are in wherever you are and you find yourself with art, which is such a great experience in the real world or in the digital world in a specialized experience. It won't reveal itself to you maybe right away. I tell my younger students, it's not like a meme that just lets you have it. It needs you to converse with it. It wants you to bring everything that you know about the world and yourself to that moment. And then it wants you to expand your knowledge and understanding a lot of the time. And sometimes when we look at the work of the 80s, it wanted to disgust you. It wanted to get a bit of a visceral reaction from you. And sometimes we turn away if we've had one of those and we think that all contemporary art is about disgust or about hard truths, but there's as much of it as unique as there are people. So just remember, it will reveal in time, but maybe not right away. And it asks a lot of questions.
Hi, this is Sarah.
Hi,
ladies.
Sarah.
It's really good. So have you seen how Ai Weiwei is being treated, given all of what's happening the last few years?
You mean that he is a man without a country?
Is he a man without a country? Is he no longer in China?
It goes back and forth. We'd have to check in with him today, but his passport status is always in question. And Ai Weiwei is somebody that he's kind of tough, and it depends on where you enter his universe. But part of his work is about whatever he is struggling with at the time. and whatever team he has. I mean, one of the most touching things that I know is after the earthquakes that he not only did installations on the front of museums with the number of backpacks as there were children that were killed in the building's collapses, but what he did previous to that was work with a team of researchers to go door to door to find out from the families the actual names of the children and their birth dates. And then he listed them online. So he is always seeking to give out information that China doesn't want out. So he is always going to be an enemy and a friend. And his heritage is also interesting in that he spent most of his childhood as a boy without a country because his father had been exiled for his political beliefs. And he did come and study in New York, which is so interesting. So it's one of the ways that we look at where an artist has traveled, where they have come from, what they know, and then what they decide to do with it. And he has a deep sense of place in China. So I don't actually, like, where is Ai Weiwei? Remember that? It was a trending hashtag on Twitter when they disappeared him. Find Ai Weiwei and free Ai Weiwei.
What were you going to say, Sarah?
Oh, I just was thanking you. That was interesting.
Oh,
yeah, he's one. And you know, he's made so many documentary films. I would recommend the one. It's called So Sorry, I think, because it's a play on words, because he's never sorry. He's sorry for what his government does, but he's never sorry for calling and shining a light on it, right? Yeah. But so many documentary films, and they're fun to put on. And when I start one, I'm like, I wonder what he's going to do this time.
Yeah, I mean, he's spent, I think the longest he's been in prison in China was 1 year.
Right, yeah.
And he goes right back to his studio. He has a huge studio, and he employs people. Like, yeah. He takes care of the workers in his gallery as if they're his family, and you know, by him paying them, it supports their families, and just an incredible artist. And he's done a lot with the international migrant issues.
The refugees, yeah.
Yeah.
That's been his big trouble lately.
Yeah, Robin?
I just want to thank you all, both. I'm like fairly new to Sarasota. I got here like right before the pandemic. So, you know, I've been sort of like hidden away, and it's nice to find a place where I feel like some of the things that you are presenting, this is really needed, and by me for one. And I'm looking for, you know, some kind of arts community that has some kind of meat on its bones, and think that I found it.
All right. Yes, thank you, Robin. Well, welcome to Sarasota, and I'm glad the pandemic's over, so we can see you in person next time.
We're trying
I hope
to
so.
the meat on the bones.
Yes.
Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Yeah. So,
thank you both. I loved it. It's Laura.
Hi, Laura.
I'm going to rewatch it and get. I would love to read up a little more about some of the texts and just the references you refer to in this presentation.
Yeah, maybe we'll put out a nice little suggested reading list.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah. Yeah, great. Well, we'll clean it up a little bit. I apologize for my technology incompetence in the beginning, but we got it ironed out, and we're happy to send it to you to watch it again. And I hope you can join us for our next one, which is October 14th, Saturday morning. And if we have enough people, we can meet in person.
That'd be great.
I think it'd be fun.
Yeah, really. I mean, we just 2 or more will meet in person. So,
great. Okay.
We're a new nonprofit, and this is our world. We love it. So it's no problem for us.
Well, I'm looking forward to plugging in more.
Yay!
Well,
thanks, ladies.
Thank you, guys, and See you in the art world.
See you soon in the real world.
Okay, bye.
Bye
Bye.
bye.
Bye.